Okay, so today we are going to talk about successful failure, 70% and then run. This is one of our core convictions, and even though we talk about this and we've talked about it many times before, it's just important that we're always bringing these things up so that we can continue to live these things out and implement them into every day. And this one is especially important to me, which I'll kind of get into why a little bit later. But for now, we'll start with the step by step of what this looks like. And this kind of feeds into the definition of it as well. So the first step in this is identifying. So this is when we're kind of discovering an idea or an initiative that could be beneficial to the team or yourself or Integrity Capital as a whole, or the client. And then we go forward to that next step of analyzing, and that'll be recognizing and examining the risk that's involved, as well as gathering any necessary information to have confidence. And that can be, mining information from our contacts, mining information from internally within Integrity Capital, and just making sure you're well researched and you know what's going on when you're trying to implement this new idea or initiative. And then the next step will be the preparation and getting the idea to 70% ready to go into action and go for its first test run. This is the big part of 70% and run, and it's just that we don't want to pour too much energy or too much effort into something before it's going for its first run, because there's always going to be something to change, there's always going to be something to improve, and there's always going to be something we can do better. But we don't need to go all the way to 100% and try to make things perfect, because that's just not realistic for a first run especially. And then that final step is going to be run, and we really focus on just going for it. It's something that we appreciate a lot, and we are really grateful and excited for anyone on the team to be able to get to 70% and have the confidence to just run with their idea and making it into a reality. So successful failure is going to be a pretty direct opposite of perfectionism. Some qualities of successful failure are that it helps us be efficient. It gives us the opportunity for trial and error and recognizes that that is something that is just inherently going to happen. It's very growth oriented, and it is most importantly realistic. On the other hand is perfectionism, which can be pretty progress impeding, and it creates unattainable expectations. It can be stress inducing, and it's overall just very unrealistic. So I want to kind of give a moment if anyone has anything else that you would add to kind of this comparison of successful failure versus perfectionism.
Yeah, I like the contrast, because I think it is true. It is the antithesis. And, perfectionism, really, we're always trying to get as close to reality as we can. And perfectionism doesn't equal reality. And just because it's not, you can't. And so I think you're spot on with the way you describe the attributes. It's great.
Did anyone else have anything they wanted?
No, I agree. I think grasping the fact that perfectionism doesn't exist is a pretty freeing thought. Because once you realize, hey, it's it just doesn't exist, because nothing is perfect the first time. And even if you have to take 2 attempts, you're off perfect, so you might as well just accept it's never going to be perfect. Don't shoot for perfectionism.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like you'll always just keep trying to hit something that doesn't exist. And then I love the progress impeding, because if you don't know how to start, you'll never finish. So if you just get it's a muscle you have to build to just get something out there, even if it's not to your liking or someone else's, at least you have something to start with, and then you build on there. So I agree 100% with that.
I definitely resonate well with this being a perfect opposite, because I am a perfectionist, and I know it's something that a lot of people struggle with, is being a perfectionist. And this has been something that's personally for me helped me grow a lot in Integrity Capital, because it allows me to be freed of that feeling of like, oh, well, I need to change this, I need to fix this, I need to do this, to try to get something to be perfect, because like I said, it's really just not realistic. It's not on our level of the world. It's just not something that is attainable. So I've shared that kind of how it has had an impact on me, but I wanted to give y'all an opportunity to share anything that is your personal experience with successful failure, or like that perfectionism feeling, and how successful failure has impacted you.
Well, I can tell you that this company is a byproduct of a lot of failures. You know, when I started the company with a partner of mine, we basically just started out of our house. We had no idea what we were doing, and we started taking on deals. And the first deal that we ever did, the client took us all the way down the road. It was a fairly sizable deal. He was making a lot of money on it, and he completely cut us out of the deal at the end and tried not to pay us our fee. And so, you know, there was all these, you know, shooting for and trying things, looking at information, and then finding out it didn't work, and realizing how important fee agreements were, you know. And so every one of the processes that we have in place is almost 100% a byproduct of some level of failure that's happened. And even this fund that's happening now, there's been so many iterations because we've ran down a road and hit a particular, you know, stumbling block. And as opposed to continuing to run at it, we just say, okay, well, what do we need to do different? And that's why we've gotten to where we are, and that's why we're getting pretty darn close. It's just so it's such, it just works, and I've seen it over and over again, and it's just fun to watch when you implement it.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to share? I know I have fellow perfectionists in here as well, if y'all want to share that experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Lana. I like to call myself a recovering perfectionist, because it is something that you just have to choose over and over and over again, to choose the 70% and go, and that's enough. Yeah, so that's made a huge difference in my whole life, not just in work life. And I would say it's also important to note that everyone's idea of perfection is different anyway. So it's like, it's not like, oh my gosh, you know, like I want to get this done perfectly so that everybody knows that it was perfectly done, because literally everybody has a different idea for that. And so I think that should give us freedom, and just saying, you know what, like we all have different standards anyway. So I'm just going to do the best that I can do. You know, I'm going to be excellent, but I don't have to strive for this unrealistic expectation for perfection.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point to emphasize on, is that it is different for everyone. Like perfect is subjective, absolutely. So even if we're sitting and waiting to try to like get to that point of perfect, like someone else's point of perfect, it could be way miles off of what yours was, or you could even have already passed that. Whenever you hit your 70%, it could be perfect to someone else. So it's definitely not something to stress.
I would say one more thing just to add, like being a perfectionist and then using, like repeating this concept over and over in my head. It's given me the ability to like move forward with things, move forward with like projects and ideas, because instead of just being stuck in like the perfectionism of having to do it, you know, a certain way, it's allowed me to keep going. And I feel like that's been a huge thing, is just like the more momentum I have with like a project or something I'm doing, it's not all about getting it done quickly, but just getting it done. And then from there you can build and learn and grow and make things better, because, you know, it just gives you that momentum to keep going.
Absolutely. So I will move on from here, and I also want to really quickly hit on type 1 and type 2 decisions, because that can be really important in successful failure. With this philosophy that we have, it's important to remember when it is and isn't right to use successful failure. And that can be very dependent on if it's a type 1 or a type 2 decision. And the things that go into a type 1 or a type 2 decision, it's basically that a type 1 decision is irreversible, it can be consequential, and it can be very costly. These are decisions that we typically want to bring up with, a manager or someone that's higher up that can make a better decision or make a final call on that. And we're not just going and jumping into something that could be very impactful to the company in a negative way. Should things go wrong. And then we have type 2 decisions that are low commitment, and you can, once you walk through that door, you can go back and shut the door. And they are low impact. And I want to define that as, it's not that it's low impact, like it won't have a big impact on the company or a big impact on your processes, but it's low impact as in, if it were to go wrong and things were to end up in a negative place, that it wouldn't be negative for the company as a whole. And type 2 decisions are most likely going to be free. But is there anything else that y'all use to identify what is or is not a type 2 decision?
Yeah, I actually really like the type 1 versus type 2, because a type 1 is probably going to be a little bit more evolved with growth, and then type 2 is kind of like the gateway to type 1, right? So you go from type 2, you just learn to get comfortable making decisions, and then type 1 will come with, potentially more consequences, but also more of an impact too. So I think it's important to get comfortable with decision making to ultimately lead to type 1 decisions.
It's a good discussion. Type 1, you just think visually that there's, as she, Lana had mentioned, it's a one-way door. So you go through it, you close it, you can't open it back up, or it's really difficult to do that. That would be an example, would be, expanding into a new market and making that decision, off the fly. There is a lot more that goes into that. It could be just hiring somebody, right? Like that's a pretty big decision that takes a lot of thought, where type 2 is probably just more daily, operational, lower cost, lower impact. There's two ways that can go. So you can come back through the door pretty easily and, pull out the broom and the pan to sweep it up. So just kind of visually, I think that's something to think about too. So great job, Lana.
I know this is something we've discussed in the past, and it's come up in conversations past, but I don't think it pops up very often. So it's probably something we should remind ourselves and each other and everybody about, is like the type 1 and type 2 decisions. And I'll say I'm a little jealous of anybody coming into Integrity Capital, like the Mackies and the Lanas, that don't go into the corporate world for a while, because this stuff is pretty freeing, but doesn't exist in some places where those low impacts, those low commitment decisions, you don't get to make those. And I know it was kind of like a wow moment when Dave and I initially had this conversation. He's like, well, there's type 1 and type 2 decisions. I'm like, I can make decisions, and it was it was pretty freeing, and it's something that I think that we should definitely make sure that everybody's aware of, like, hey, make decisions, make changes, lead change, and set yourself up for some failures, because that's where the growth happens.
Definitely. I think it is very, oh, go ahead.
I found that my journey with type 1 and type 2 decisions has been a little bit rocky in the sense that, like, coming from such a perfectionistic background, I just held so much importance on every decision. And so it was kind of hard for me to untangle that for a little while. So just encouragement, if you guys are struggling figuring out if it's a type 1 or a type 2, reach out to someone, and maybe bounce your ideas off of them to just see what they think, because most likely it's a type 2 decision is what I'm finding. Like type 1 decisions, they really are irreversible, consequential, and costly, and maybe even more so than what you're even giving the threshold in your own mind. So that's been really freeing for me to just like zoom out when I'm like struggling with, oh, which one is this? I just zoom out and say, okay, is this really irreversible? Is this really consequential? And is this really costly?
Yeah, I can definitely agree with you there, Michelle, on the perfectionism and how it kind of makes this hard with how much you feel like every decision matters so much to everything. And when it's written here in this black and white, or I guess this is blue and white, but when it's written here like this, it seems so easy. But I think it is really something that, like Tom said, we need to focus on and make sure that we're telling people as they join us, because that's so freeing and it's so helpful, and it really does give people the room to grow and the room to just learn that like it's okay for me to make decisions and that we trust them, and it gives them that space to get to the point of innovation out of frustration as well. Now that we have hit that type 1 and type 2 point, I want to kind of show what the manifestation of this is. And so the beginning of this, when it happens in actual time, it's, you know, noticing that a process that you're doing could be easier. And this is just an example, but noticing that you're doing something and it's, you know, this could be more streamlined, or it would be easier for me if I did this in this way instead. And once you notice that and have an idea for how to make it better, then it's making that decision of, is this a type 1 or a type 2 decision? And that might mean you want to ask someone and make sure that it's a type 1 or type 2 decision, and make sure that it is a type 2 decision. And then once you have figured out that, yes, this is a type 2 decision, you go into mining for information. So that'd be, you know, reaching out to our contacts, reaching out to people internally, and just figuring out what the best way to go about making a change or implementing a new process, or just finding a new way to do things would be. And that can even be researching online or anything like that, just so that you have enough information to feel confidence in yourself. And then the next step would be putting in the work. And this might be something that's more just downloading a new way to do something, or creating a new document where you store information. But it could also be something that takes you a little bit more time, but that step's just, you know, putting in the work and getting things ready to go so that you can move on to implementation and really testing out your idea, giving it its first run, and just seeing how things play out. And then once you've let that go on for a little bit, depending on what your specific idea was, it could be that you're trying that out for a week and then going to reviewing it, or it could be that you kind of need a few weeks to see how it works and see if it's something that you prefer over the old process. And you'll move on to reviewing that and kind of looking at how your process was versus, or your new idea was versus the old way that you were doing things. And at this point, you might find, you know, the old way was really better, but it's still good that you tried that. Or it might be that you're like, wow, I'm so glad that I did this. This has worked out so much better for me. And the most important part of this is going to be improving and growing. So once you hit that review, you're still going to find things that could be better. You're still going to find things that you could change. And at that point, you want to improve and grow. And even if this process didn't work out, that's a really great point to improve and grow, because you can see, okay, well, I didn't need to make this change, but I did notice that when I was doing that, it made this part easier. And that might be something else you end up improving, but it's always good to reflect and see how we can grow and do better from that. And if there's anything that anyone wants to add here, I can still pause for a second.
Yeah, I love the visual. What I would tell you is that, I'll just give you a quick example. You know, we with the fund, we obviously raised, you went through the process, a bunch of iterations, and then finally, you know, found a couple of investors on the general partnership, you know, put together a general term sheet just to, you know, get things going. So we made the type 2 decision, mined a bunch of information, meaning that we put something in writing and then put it out to a couple of investors to get feedback, and went back and forth through a few conversations to realize that structure doesn't work, and then, you know, adjusted it by putting in the work then and implementing it now, and then obviously we'll review it as we go through and improve. There are times, for example, we got a lot of feedback because we're a first-time fund that it's going to be really challenging. And so what we decided was, well, why don't we change our approach and see if we can hitch up to another fund that's already established. And then maybe what'll happen is it'll just create the credibility we need to break through that barrier. Well, I called 5 different groups, spoke to 3 that were established funds. They all said, yes, we'd be willing to do that. And then mining for information went back to the groups. One of the groups was a major one that kind of knew the market on the placement side, and described my idea to him. And he immediately said, it's not going to work. He said, you have to be able to have the credentials and the credibility, even if you're KKR, which is the largest fund in the world. And so we stopped there, right? We didn't have to go to put to work, implement, go through. So sometimes you have to stop at mining and go back through again and pull it through. So we came up with a new idea where we think is going to work. So just something to remember, like you might not go all the way through the road. You might stop at mining for information because you go, that doesn't work. And then you go back through again. So just something to think about as you go through.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. We don't always end up there, or it could even be that you realize something that you want to change is more of a type 1 decision, and then you end up stopping there as well. So I think that's a great point to hit on. On the other part of this, we also have to recognize when we shouldn't use the successful failure approach. There are points that it's just not a great thing to use, and that can be type 1 decisions like we discussed. And there are other things that can bring us to a point that it's, that's not really something that we should practice successful failure with. And that could be a decision that would negatively impact our relationships as a business, or decisions that require extensive research and strong discernment to get to that point of even being able to implement. But is there anything else that y'all can think of that it's really best to avoid practicing successful failure with those things?
I think if it's something, and maybe this is kind of like a type 1 decision, but maybe if it's like a time window, like if it's something where you kind of just, maybe it's just because this does fall into like a type 1 decision, but like something there's like a small window to act on something, you don't really want to like spitball an idea. You really want to make sure that you go the extra mile on taking that to like a 90% sure, and sure before like a 70% sure, because you could just lose the window of opportunity.
I
For
would
sure.
I would just add, and maybe this isn't what the question's asking, but not allowing this to be your excuse not to give it, like, you're, I guess, 100%, but like 70%, I should say. But not letting it be your excuse to not give it your all. Don't let this be like a cop out of like, oh, I only have to go 70%, so I'm just not gonna try super hard. And I don't think any one of us have that attitude, but I would say this is just an example of, not letting a successful failure make your work like less than it should be.
Definitely. Yeah, we don't want to use it as an easy way out. It's really for growth for sure. And I do like what you said, Tom, about having it like things that are time bound. Yeah, we want to make sure that we're still giving as much as we need to give. Something else I want to focus on is what successful failure is not. And it is not this cycle of making a mistake and then seeing that something can be improved and maybe temporarily implement that improvement, and then unfortunately end up reverting your improvement and then making the same mistake again. This is about growth, and it's about us doing better and improving. So we don't want to end up in this cycle of an excuse to make a mistake again of, well, I just went 70% and then I went the same 70% again and did it again. And we're ending up in a cycle of making the same mistakes. That's not a successful failure. It's just repeated mistakes. And successful failure is about growth and moving forward and getting things done. So that is the presentation that I have for y'all. If you have anything else that you want to add, then feel free to do so. But that's all I've got for you.